Picture this. You're standing in your own driveway watching three police cars pull up to your house, lights flashing, because your HOA board president just called 911 claiming you're running an illegal operation out of your garage. The same garage they forced you to give them keys to just 24 hours earlier. The same garage that contains nothing more controversial than Christmas decorations and your late father's woodworking tools. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. When those officers walked into that garage, what they discovered wasn't illegal contraband or a code violation. What they found was so perfectly, beautifully legal that it turned the entire HOA board into a laughingstock and ultimately cost them their positions, their credibility, and thousands of dollars in legal fees. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below because you are about to witness one of the most satisfying examples of HOA overreach backfiring in spectacular fashion. This isn't just another neighbor dispute. This is the story of how one man's patience, preparation, and perfect timing exposed an entire corrupt HOA board and changed his community forever. Marcus Thompson thought he was moving into his dream neighborhood. He had no idea he was walking into a battlefield where property rights would become weapons, and where his own garage would become ground zero for a conflict that would shake Maplewood Estates to its very foundation. Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of person who believed in following rules. At 42, the soft-spoken accountant had spent most of his adult life in apartments, dreaming of the day he could finally afford a house with a garage where he could continue his father's legacy of woodworking. When his promotion came through at the accounting firm where he'd worked for 8 years, that dream finally became reality. Maplewood Estates seemed perfect on paper. The suburban development in Riverside County boasted well-maintained streets, mature oak trees lining every block, and houses that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread about the American dream. The realtor had mentioned the HOA, of course, but presented it as a positive feature. Someone else would handle the landscaping standards, ensure property values stayed high, and maintain the community pool and playground. Marcus signed the papers on his 3-bedroom ranch-style home in March, and by April he was settled in with his most prized possessions. His late father's collection of hand tools, a vintage workbench that had been built in 1963, and dreams of weekend projects that would honor his dad's memory. The 2-car garage was spacious enough for his Honda Accord and still left plenty of room for a proper woodworking setup. For the first 6 months, Marcus flew completely under the radar. He kept his lawn immaculate, his driveway clean, and his house painted in one of the 3 approved neutral colors from the HOA handbook. He attended exactly 1 HOA meeting, found it mind-numbingly boring, and decided his time was better spent actually enjoying his new home rather than debating whether beige mailbox posts were somehow superior to black ones. But stay with me here, because this is where things start getting interesting. Marcus was about to discover that in Maplewood Estates, flying under the radar wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. Because the HOA board, led by President Patricia Hendricks, had turned surveillance into an art form. Patricia Hendricks was the kind of HOA president who gave HOA presidents a bad name. A 63-year-old retired real estate agent with apparently unlimited time on her hands, she had held the position for 7 consecutive years through a combination of intimidation, manipulation, and the fact that most residents were too exhausted by their day jobs to attend meetings and challenge her authority. Patricia didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. Her daily routine included a morning neighborhood quality inspection that was really just an excuse to peer into yards, note any perceived violations, and maintain detailed files on every resident. She had successfully forced 3 families to repaint their homes, convinced 2 residents to remove non-conforming garden decorations, and had made it her personal mission to ensure that no one in Maplewood Estates ever forgot who was really in charge. Patricia's board consisted of 4 other residents who had learned that agreeing with her was far easier than challenging her. There was Robert Chen, the treasurer, who had discovered that questioning Patricia's spending led to public humiliation at board meetings. Sarah Mitchell, the secretary, had tried to suggest more reasonable enforcement policies once and had found herself facing a bogus conflict of interest investigation that lasted 3 months. The other 2 board members, James Wilson and Linda Rodriguez, had essentially become silent partners in Patricia's increasingly authoritarian reign. Marcus first appeared on Patricia's radar in October, 7 months after moving in. The trigger was absurdly minor. He had left his garage door open while organizing tools on a Saturday afternoon. Patricia, during her routine inspection walk, noticed the open door and peered inside long enough to see workbenches, tools, and what looked to her like commercial activity potential. Now here's where this story takes its first dramatic turn, because Patricia wasn't just nosy, she was paranoid. In her mind, every resident was either a potential code violator, a property value threat, or someone trying to circumvent HOA authority. The sight of Marcus's organized workshop didn't register as a normal hobby. Instead, her suspicious mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios: unlicensed contracting, illegal business operations, or unapproved structural modifications. The first indication Marcus had that he was now on Patricia's hit list came in the form of a formal letter dated October 15th. The letter, printed on official Maplewood Estates HOA letterhead, informed him that anonymous complaints had been received regarding potential commercial activity being conducted from his garage. The letter demanded that he provide written documentation proving that no business operations were taking place on the property. Marcus initially thought the letter was a joke. He read it 3 times, showed it to his neighbor Janet across the street, and they both laughed at the absurdity. But when Janet saw the serious look on his face, she stopped laughing and shared something that made Marcus's stomach sink. Patricia had done this before. 3 times in the past 2 years, residents had received similar letters, and 2 of them had eventually sold their homes and moved rather than continue fighting the constant harassment. The letter included a deadline. Marcus had 14 days to provide the requested documentation or face potential fines and further investigation into the matter. It also contained a paragraph that made Marcus pause. The HOA reserved the right to conduct reasonable inspections to ensure compliance with community standards and local zoning laws. Marcus spent that evening carefully reading through every page of his HOA agreement, the community bylaws, and the covenant conditions and restrictions that governed Maplewood Estates. What he found wasn't encouraging. The documents contained vague language about maintaining residential character and preventing commercial use, but they also granted the HOA board broad authority to investigate and enforce these standards. But remember what I said about Marcus being detail-oriented? This is where that trait became crucial, because Marcus didn't just read the documents, he researched them. He spent the next week diving into California HOA law, property rights statutes, and legal precedents involving homeowner association overreach. What he discovered would eventually become the foundation for everything that followed. Marcus learned that while HOAs did have enforcement authority, that authority had limits. They couldn't conduct searches without reasonable cause, they couldn't demand access to private areas of homes without specific evidence of violations, and they definitely couldn't harassment residents with repeated baseless accusations. More importantly, he learned that California law required HOAs to follow specific procedures for inspections, fines, and enforcement actions. Patricia, as Marcus would soon discover, had been ignoring most of these legal requirements for years, relying on residents' ignorance and their reluctance to fight back. But Marcus wasn't like the previous residents who had simply moved away. Marcus was an accountant who understood documentation, procedures, and the importance of creating paper trails. His response letter to the HOA, dated October 28th, was a masterpiece of measured defiance. In carefully neutral language, Marcus provided a detailed inventory of his garage contents: personal tools, inherited woodworking equipment, holiday decorations, and automotive supplies. He included photographs documenting that no commercial signage, customer parking, or business operations existed on the property. Most importantly, he concluded with a paragraph that would later prove prophetic. He welcomed any inspection conducted in accordance with applicable laws and HOA procedures. He requested that any future concerns be documented with specific evidence rather than anonymous complaints. Now, if Patricia had been smart, she would have backed down at this point. Marcus had provided exactly what she asked for. He had done so professionally and thoroughly, and any reasonable person would have considered the matter closed. But Patricia wasn't reasonable, and Marcus's well-documented response didn't satisfy her. It infuriated her. Because in Patricia's world, residents weren't supposed to know their rights. They weren't supposed to respond with legal language and procedural knowledge. They were supposed to be intimidated, apologetic, and compliant. Marcus's letter read like it had been written by someone who understood exactly what the HOA could and couldn't legally do, and that terrified her. The war between Marcus Thompson and Patricia Hendricks was about to begin in earnest, and neither of them yet realized that Marcus's garage would soon become the most scrutinized piece of real estate in all of Maplewood Estates. Patricia's response to Marcus's detailed documentation was swift and predictable. She decided to escalate. If Marcus wanted to play by the rules, she would show him just how creative she could get with rule interpretation. The second letter arrived on November 5th, exactly 1 week after Marcus had provided his comprehensive garage inventory. This time, the accusations were more specific and more troubling. Patricia claimed that multiple residents had reported seeing commercial vehicles in Marcus's driveway, unusual traffic patterns to his home, and evidence of ongoing construction or manufacturing activities. The letter went on to state that these concerns required immediate investigation to protect property values and ensure community safety. Marcus read the letter twice, then walked outside and looked at his driveway. His Honda Accord sat exactly where it always did. No commercial vehicles, no unusual traffic, no construction materials. He had hosted exactly 2 visitors in the past month, his sister and a co-worker who had stopped by to drop off some files. The most construction-like activity he had engaged in was hanging a new bathroom mirror. But here's where Patricia's harassment campaign started revealing its true nature, and why you need to pay attention to what happened next, because it demonstrates how HOA abuse typically escalates. The letter didn't just contain false accusations. It contained a demand that represented a massive invasion of privacy. Patricia was demanding immediate access to Marcus's garage for a comprehensive inspection, to document any code violations, business activities, or structural modifications. The letter stated that failure to provide this access within 72 hours would result in daily fines of $50 and potential legal action to enforce the HOA's legitimate authority. Marcus felt his blood pressure rise as he read the demand. Patricia wanted full access to his private property based on anonymous complaints about activities that weren't happening. She wanted to inventory his personal belongings, photograph his private space, and essentially treat him like a criminal based on absolutely no evidence of any wrongdoing. But Marcus had learned enough about HOA law to know that Patricia was spectacularly overreaching her authority. California Civil Code Section 4750 specifically limited HOA inspection rights, requiring reasonable cause and proper notice. More importantly, the inspection had to be related to specific violations of actual rules, not fishing expeditions based on paranoia and anonymous complaints. Marcus's second response letter, dated November 8th, was longer and more pointed than his first. He systematically addressed each accusation, providing documentation that refuted every claim. Security camera footage from his doorbell system showed exactly 2 visitors in the past month. His vehicle registration proved that his Honda was not a commercial vehicle. Photographs demonstrated that no construction or manufacturing activities were taking place in his garage or anywhere else on his property. Now here's the part that really shows Marcus's strategic thinking and why this story ultimately has such a satisfying ending. Marcus didn't just defend himself, he went on the offensive. His letter concluded with a formal complaint about Patricia's harassment, documented the timeline of escalating false accusations, and requested that the full HOA board review Patricia's conduct to ensure it complied with both the CCNRs and California law. Marcus also did something that Patricia had not expected. He copied the letter to every homeowner in Maplewood Estates. All 127 households received Marcus's detailed response, complete with copies of Patricia's accusatory letters and his documented refutations. For the first time in Patricia's 7-year reign, residents were seeing exactly how their HOA president conducted business, and many of them didn't like what they saw. The community response was swift and divided. About 30 residents reached out to Marcus privately, sharing their own stories of Patricia's harassment and expressing support for his stand against her overreach. But Patricia also had her defenders, longtime residents who either feared challenging her authority or genuinely believed that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain property values. Stay with me, because this is where Patricia made the mistake that would ultimately destroy her. It's a mistake that reveals the dangerous mindset of power-drunk HOA officials everywhere. Instead of backing down in the face of community scrutiny, Patricia doubled down on her demands and made the conflict personal. The third letter arrived on November 20th, and it was clear that Patricia had consulted with the HOA's lawyer. The language was more formal, the legal threats more specific, and the demands more extreme. Patricia was now claiming that Marcus' pattern of non-compliance and defiance demonstrated a clear intent to violate community standards. She accused him of creating a hostile environment and undermining legitimate HOA authority. Most significantly, the letter contained an ultimatum that would prove to be Patricia's fatal error. Marcus had exactly 5 days to provide the HOA board with keys to his garage, or face immediate daily fines of $100 and potential legal action for breach of his HOA agreement. Patricia's demand for garage keys was legally questionable at best, and Marcus knew it. But he also realized that Patricia was now committed to a path that could only end in complete victory for her, or complete destruction of her authority. She had made the conflict public, staked her reputation on forcing Marcus to comply, and crossed legal lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Marcus spent the Thanksgiving weekend researching his options. He consulted with a property rights attorney, reviewed dozens of similar cases, and studied the specific language in Maplewood Estates' governing documents. What he discovered was both encouraging and concerning. Patricia was almost certainly exceeding her legal authority, but fighting her would require time, money, and emotional energy that could drag on for months. But remember, Marcus had one crucial advantage that Patricia didn't know about. And this is where the story starts building toward that incredible climax I mentioned at the beginning. Marcus's father had been more than just a hobbyist woodworker. He had been a master craftsman who had spent 40 years building custom furniture cabinets and architectural details for some of the most expensive homes in Northern California. When Marcus inherited his father's tools, he hadn't just inherited hammers and saws. He had inherited a complete professional workshop worth approximately $45,000, including rare vintage hand tools, precision measuring instruments, and several pieces of equipment that were now considered collector's items. More importantly, he had inherited his father's meticulous documentation. Every tool was cataloged, photographed, and appraised for insurance purposes. Marcus realized that Patricia's demand for garage access might actually work in his favor. If she wanted to see what was in his garage, he would show her exactly what was there, and he would document her reaction in a way that would expose her harassment campaign for what it really was. His response to Patricia's ultimatum was brief and devastating in its simplicity. Marcus agreed to provide garage access to the HOA board, but only under specific conditions. The inspection would be conducted during normal business hours with at least 2 board members present, All inspections would be video recorded for legal documentation, and any findings would be documented in writing with specific citations of alleged violations. Marcus also included one additional condition that seemed almost innocent, but was actually brilliant strategic positioning. He requested that local law enforcement be notified of the inspection in advance, since Patricia had repeatedly suggested that his garage might contain illegal activities or code violations. Now think about what Marcus had just done, because this move demonstrates why preparation and legal knowledge are so powerful against HOA bullies. Marcus had turned Patricia's harassment into a formal legal process that would be documented, witnessed, and officially recorded. If Patricia found violations, she would have to prove them. If she didn't find violations, her harassment campaign would be exposed as baseless persecution. Patricia received Marcus's response on November 29th, and for the first time since this conflict began, she hesitated. The demands for documentation, witnesses, and law enforcement notification weren't what she had expected. She had been hoping that Marcus would either comply meekly or refuse outright. Either response would have allowed her to maintain control of the situation. But Marcus had chosen a third option. He was calling her bluff in the most public and documented way possible. Patricia now faced a choice between backing down and admitting that her threats were empty, or following through with an inspection that would either vindicate her accusations or expose her as a harassment-obsessed tyrant. And here's where you can probably guess what Patricia decided, because power-drunk HOA presidents never choose the reasonable option when the unreasonable one is available. Patricia scheduled the inspection for December 3rd at 10 a.m. with the full board in attendance and, as Marcus had requested, advance notification to local law enforcement. Marcus spent the weekend before the inspection preparing in ways that Patricia couldn't have imagined. He organized his father's tools into perfect displays, printed detailed documentation for every piece of equipment, and set up multiple cameras to record every moment of the inspection from different angles. He even created a comprehensive inventory list with photographs and values for every item in the garage. But Marcus's most important preparation was completely invisible. He had spent weeks documenting Patricia's harassment campaign, researching California laws governing HOA authority, and building a case that would demonstrate not just that Patricia was wrong, but that she had been systematically violating residents' rights for years. December 3rd arrived with the kind of crisp morning that made Maplewood Estates look like a suburban paradise. Marcus was ready. Patricia thought she was ready. Neither of them could have predicted what was about to unfold when that garage door opened and revealed contents that would change everything. Because what Patricia was about to discover in Marcus's garage wasn't illegal contraband or code violations, and what happened next would turn her from neighborhood enforcer into neighborhood laughingstock in a matter of minutes. December 3rd, 10 a.m. Marcus stood in his driveway watching as Patricia Hendricks approached with the full HOA board in tow, looking like a general leading troops into battle. She carried a clipboard, a camera, and an expression of grim satisfaction that suggested she expected this inspection to finally expose whatever nefarious activities she was convinced Marcus was hiding. The police cruiser arrived exactly on time, as Marcus had requested. Officer Jennifer Martinez stepped out, looking mildly confused about why she was needed for an HOA inspection, but professional enough to understand that sometimes neighbor disputes required official documentation to prevent escalation. Marcus had positioned his phone to record the entire interaction, a decision that would prove absolutely crucial for what was about to unfold. Patricia approached with her board members trailing behind like reluctant participants in a drama they weren't sure they wanted to be part of. Now, picture this moment, because it's the turning point where Patricia's months of harassment were about to collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible. Patricia had built this inspection up in her own mind as the moment she would finally expose Marcus as a rule-violating troublemaker. She had spent weeks crafting her narrative: mysterious commercial activity, illegal business operations, clear violations of community standards. Patricia demanded that Marcus open his garage door immediately so the inspection could begin. Her tone was commanding, imperious, and designed to assert her authority in front of the board and the police officer. Marcus complied without argument, pressing the garage door remote with a calm expression that should have been Patricia's first warning that this wasn't going to go the way she expected. The garage door rolled up smoothly, revealing an interior so perfectly organized and pristine that it looked like something from a home improvement magazine. Every tool had its designated place on custom-built pegboards. The workbench area was spotless and arranged with museum-quality precision. Storage bins were labeled and arranged by category. The concrete floor was sealed and polished to a mirror shine. But what stopped Patricia in her tracks was not the organization. It was the obvious quality and value of everything in the space. Even someone with no knowledge of woodworking could see that this wasn't a hobbyist's garage workshop. This was a professional-grade operation with tools and equipment that represented serious investment and expertise. Here's where Patricia made her first critical error, and you're going to love how this backfired on her. Instead of acknowledging that the garage contained exactly what Marcus had documented in his letters, personal woodworking tools and inherited equipment, Patricia immediately assumed that the quality of the setup proved her suspicions were correct. Patricia began taking photographs and making notes with an air of vindication, commenting loudly to the board members about commercial-grade equipment and clear evidence of business operations. She pointed to the professional workbench as proof of manufacturing activity and photographed the tool organization system as evidence of commercial inventory management. Officer Martinez watched this performance with growing confusion. She had reviewed the complaint before arriving and understood that the issue involved potential code violations or illegal business operations. What she was seeing in Marcus's garage was a beautifully maintained personal workshop that showed no signs of commercial activity, customer traffic, or anything that would constitute a legal violation. Marcus stood quietly during Patricia's initial inspection, allowing her to document everything she wanted while his phone captured her increasingly excited commentary about proof of violations. But when Patricia demanded access to his tool inventory and started suggesting that certain items were too expensive for personal use, Marcus decided it was time to provide some education. And this is where Marcus revealed just how thoroughly he had prepared for this moment, demonstrating why patience and preparation are such powerful weapons against HOA bullying. Marcus calmly began providing detailed explanations for every item Patricia questioned, complete with documentation that proved ownership, value, and legitimacy. That commercial-grade table saw? It was a 1967 Powermatic Model 66, inherited from his father and worth approximately $8,000 as a collector's item. Marcus produced the original purchase receipt signed by his father in 1967, along with insurance documentation and appraisal records. Was Patricia photographing the professional manufacturing equipment? A collection of hand planes, chisels, and measuring tools manufactured between 1920 and 1960, each piece documented in his father's meticulous inventory records. Marcus had printouts showing that similar tools were selling at auction for hundreds of dollars each, making his inherited collection worth more than most people's cars. The commercial inventory system that had caught Patricia's attention. An organizational method his father had developed over 4 decades of professional craftsmanship, designed to prevent damage to irreplaceable vintage tools and ensure that each piece remained in museum-quality condition. As Marcus provided documentation for each questioned item, Patricia's confidence began to waver. But instead of acknowledging that she might have misunderstood the situation, she doubled down on her accusations in increasingly desperate ways. She suggested that the value of the tools proved that Marcus must be using them commercially. She argued that no one needed such high-quality equipment for personal projects. She even implied that Marcus might have stolen the collection because the tools were too valuable for an accountant to own legitimately. This is the moment when Patricia crossed the line from harassment into defamation, and Officer Martinez's expression shifted from confusion to concern. The police officer had been present for enough neighbor disputes to recognize when someone was making serious accusations without evidence, and Patricia's increasingly wild claims were starting to sound like harassment rather than legitimate code enforcement. Marcus remained calm throughout Patricia's escalating accusations, continuing to provide documentation and evidence while his phone recorded every word. But when Patricia suggested that he might have acquired the tools illegally, Marcus decided it was time to reveal the full scope of his preparation. Marcus retrieved a folder from his workbench and handed it to Officer Martinez. The folder contained his father's complete workshop documentation, 40 years of purchase receipts, insurance records, appraisal documents, and even photographs showing his father using many of the tools in professional projects throughout his career. The documentation was so thorough that it read like a museum catalog with provenance and value established for every significant item in the garage. Officer Martinez spent several minutes reviewing the documentation while Patricia continued making increasingly frantic claims about code violations and commercial use. The more evidence Marcus provided, the more desperate Patricia became, and the more obvious it became that her accusations were baseless harassment rather than legitimate concerns. But here's where this story takes its most satisfying turn, because Marcus wasn't finished educating Patricia about the legal realities of HOA authority. While Patricia continued her inspection and made notes about imaginary violations, Marcus quietly asked Officer Martinez if she would be willing to document her observations about the garage contents and Patricia's conduct during the inspection. Officer Martinez agreed, and her official report would later become a crucial piece of evidence. The report noted that the garage contained a valuable collection of vintage woodworking tools and equipment properly maintained and stored for personal use, and that no evidence of commercial activity code violations or illegal operations was observed during the inspection. More importantly for Marcus's long-term strategy, the report also documented Patricia's behavior during the inspection. Her repeated accusations without evidence, her suggestions of illegal activity without basis, and her apparent harassment of a homeowner who was clearly in compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Patricia spent nearly an hour in Marcus's garage, photographing, measuring, and documenting everything she could find. She questioned the legitimacy of every tool, suggested that proper organization was evidence of commercial use, and even implied that the cleanliness of the space proved that illegal activities must be taking place there. And then Patricia made the mistake that would ultimately end her HOA presidency, demonstrating how power-drunk officials often destroy themselves through their own overreach. Unable to find any actual violations in Marcus's garage, Patricia decided to create some. Patricia announced to the assembled group that regardless of what the garage currently contained, the quality and value of the equipment represented clear intent for commercial use, and violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the community's residential restrictions. She declared that Marcus would have 30 days to remove all professional-grade body equipment from his property or face daily fines of $200. Officer Martinez looked up from her documentation with obvious surprise. She had just spent an hour observing an inspection that revealed no legal violations, no code problems, and no evidence of the commercial activity that had supposedly triggered the investigation. Now the HOA president was essentially inventing violations based on the quality of legally owned personal property. Marcus's response was quiet but devastating in its implications. He asked Patricia to specify exactly which community rules prohibited residents from owning valuable tools, high-quality equipment, or inherited collections. He requested written documentation of the specific violations she was citing, and asked for references to the exact language in the CC&Rs that supported her demands. Patricia couldn't provide specifics because no such rules existed. The Maplewood Estate's governing documents prohibited commercial use of property, but ownership of quality tools wasn't commercial use. They required compliance with local zoning laws, but personal workshops were completely legal in residential areas. They established standards for property maintenance, but Marcus's garage was immaculately maintained. Watch what happened next, because this is where Patricia's months of harassment and legal overreach finally collapsed under the weight of documentation and witnesses. Faced with Marcus's request for specific rule citations, Patricia made the statement that would ultimately destroy her credibility and end her HOA career. Patricia declared that she didn't need to cite specific rules because her authority as HOA president gave her the right to interpret community standards as she saw fit. She stated that expensive tools created an appearance of commercial activity regardless of how they were actually used. Most damaging of all, she announced that residents who challenged her authority were demonstrating the kind of attitude that threatened community harmony and property values. Officer Martinez finished writing her report and closed her notebook with an expression that suggested she had seen enough. She approached Marcus and quietly suggested that he might want to consult with an attorney about documenting the harassment campaign he appeared to be experiencing, since her report would be available if he needed official documentation of the day's events. The HOA board members who had accompanied Patricia were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized that their president had just conducted an hour-long investigation that found no violations, then invented new rules to justify punishment anyway. Several of them began asking Patricia quiet questions about the legal basis for her demands, questions she couldn't answer because there was no legal basis. But Patricia wasn't finished destroying her own credibility, and what she did next would become the most quoted part of Marcus's eventual legal complaint against the HOA. Frustrated by the board members' questions and Marcus's calm documentation of her overreach, Patricia made the threat that would trigger the 911 call I mentioned at the beginning of this story. Patricia announced that if Marcus didn't voluntarily surrender his garage keys within 24 hours, she would consider his expensive tool collection to be evidence of either theft or illegal business operations, and she would contact law enforcement to investigate both possibilities. She stated that no legitimate homeowner needed tools that valuable, and anyone who refused HOA inspection demands was obviously hiding illegal activity. Marcus's phone captured every word of Patricia's threat, including her statement that she would falsely report suspected criminal activity to force compliance with her demands. Officer Martinez heard the threat as well, and her report would later note that the HOA president had suggested filing false police reports as an enforcement mechanism. Patricia left Marcus' property that day, convinced that she had finally gathered enough evidence to force his compliance or justify legal action against him. She had no idea that multiple witnesses had thoroughly documented her threats, accusations, and legal overreach, or that Marcus was already building a case that would expose her harassment campaign and ultimately remove her from power. The 911 call came exactly 26 hours later, triggered not by anything Marcus had done, but by Patricia's realization that her inspection had backfired in ways she was only beginning to understand. And what happened when those police cars arrived at Marcus's house would complete Patricia's transformation from neighborhood enforcer to community pariah. The morning of December 4th started quietly for Marcus. He had spent the previous evening organizing the documentation from Patricia's garage inspection and consulting with the property rights attorney he had contacted weeks earlier. The attorney's advice was clear. Patricia had exceeded her authority, made threats without legal basis, and created a documented pattern of harassment that violated both HOA procedures and California law. Marcus was reviewing his legal options when his doorbell rang at 9:47 a.m. He opened the door to find Officer Martinez standing on his porch, looking professional but slightly apologetic. She explained that Patricia Hendricks had called 911 approximately 30 minutes earlier, reporting suspicious activity and potential criminal operations at Marcus's address. Now remember what I told you at the beginning about that 911 call, because this is where Patricia's harassment campaign reached its most absurd and self-destructive climax. Patricia had called emergency services, claiming that Marcus was operating an illegal business out of his garage, storing stolen property, and had threatened her when she attempted to conduct a legitimate inspection. Officer Martinez had been assigned to respond to the call specifically because she had been present for the previous day's inspection and could provide context for whatever Patricia was claiming had happened. Her presence turned out to be crucial because Patricia's 911 report bore no resemblance to the events that Officer Martinez had personally witnessed and documented. 2 additional patrol cars arrived within minutes, their presence drawing the attention of neighbors throughout Maplewood Estates. Marcus found himself standing in his driveway, surrounded by police officers, while curious residents gathered to watch the drama unfold. Patricia had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that she probably hoped would pressure Marcus into compliance. But Patricia had made a critical miscalculation. Officer Martinez immediately briefed the responding officers on the previous day's inspection, sharing her report and explaining that she had found no evidence of any illegal activity or code violations. She described Patricia's behavior during the inspection, including her increasingly desperate attempts to find violations and her final threats to file false reports. This is where the story reaches its most satisfying turning point, because the very spectacle Patricia created to intimidate Marcus became the stage for her complete humiliation. The lead officer, Sergeant Robert Hayes, requested to see Marcus's garage one more time to verify Officer Martinez's report and determine if Patricia's 911 call had any basis in reality. Marcus opened his garage door for the second time in 2 days, revealing the same perfectly organized workshop that had contained no violations during the previous inspection. Sergeant Hayes spent 15 minutes reviewing the space, checking Marcus's documentation, and comparing the reality of the garage to Patricia's emergency report. The conclusion was swift and unambiguous. Patricia had filed a false police report. The garage contained exactly what it had contained the day before: valuable but legal personal property, no commercial activity, no stolen goods, and no evidence of any criminal behavior. Patricia had used emergency services to harass a neighbor over a civil HOA dispute. But wait, because this gets even better and demonstrates why documentation and preparation are so powerful against bullies who think they can abuse their authority without consequences. While Sergeant Hayes was examining the garage, Patricia arrived on scene, having apparently rushed over to assist with the investigation she had triggered. Patricia's arrival was perfectly timed to witness the destruction of her credibility. She approached the officers expecting to see Marcus being questioned about criminal activity or code violations. Instead, she found Sergeant Hayes documenting the same legal, well-maintained workshop that Officer Martinez had reported the day before. Patricia immediately began explaining to Sergeant Hayes why the garage contents were suspicious, why Marcus's tools were evidence of illegal activity, and why the officers needed to search more thoroughly to find the commercial operations she was convinced existed. Her explanations sounded increasingly frantic, as it became clear that the officers weren't finding anything to support her claims. Sergeant Hayes listened to Patricia's explanations with the patient professionalism of someone who deals with unreasonable people regularly. Then he asked Patricia to explain why she had reported suspicious activity when Officer Martinez's report from the previous day clearly documented that no such activity existed. Patricia's response revealed the depth of her obsession and the extent of her legal misunderstanding. She argued that expensive tools were inherently suspicious in a residential area. She claimed that Marcus's refusal to accept her authority proved he was hiding illegal activity. She insisted that the organization and cleanliness of the workshop demonstrated commercial use regardless of what the officers could prove. Now here's the moment that changed everything, not just for Marcus and Patricia, but for the entire Maplewood Estates community. Sergeant Hayes asked Patricia directly if she understood that filing false police reports was a criminal offense, and if she was aware that harassment of neighbors could result in legal consequences for her personally. Patricia's answer demonstrated just how completely she had lost touch with reality and legal boundaries. She insisted that she had the authority as HOA president to determine what was suspicious and to involve law enforcement in HOA matters. She argued that Marcus's challenge to her authority was the real problem and that the police should be supporting her efforts to maintain community standards. Sergeant Hayes explained calmly but firmly that HOA authority did not extend to filing false police reports, that civil disputes could not be resolved through emergency services, and that Patricia's conduct over the past 2 days appeared to constitute harassment rather than legitimate enforcement activity. The conversation between Sergeant Hayes and Patricia was overheard by at least a dozen neighbors who had gathered to watch the police response. Word spread quickly through Maplewood Estates that their HOA president had called 911 to report an imaginary,